Hi, as you will see, Gary's taken a week off from recording his weekly message, and he and Gail are taking a few well-earned days rest off in Bath. So I'm having a go at it this week. For those who don't know me, I'm Mike Watts, and I'm a local preacher at Droitwich Spa Methodist Church. Firstly, I hope that all of you who are listening to me are okay. I suppose that in these strange times that feeling okay is possibly the best we can hope for, although things seem to be improving, things are still very uncertain, not least about when we can go back to meeting again in church and how that will happen and exactly when. It therefore seems rather strange to me when I looked up the Bible reading set for this coming Sunday, the 2nd of August, that the title of the Sunday was shown as the 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time. It seemed to me that it was rather a strange title at any time for the Christian year, that period between Trinity Sunday and Advent. But when I thought about it for this year, it seemed particularly inappropriate for this is anything but ordinary time, is it? So perhaps it was better titled the 18th, or is it the 19th Sunday in anything but ordinary time? Anyway, whatever the title of the Sunday, I found that one of the set readings for this Sunday was from Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 to 21. And I guess that it's one of the most familiar stories in the Bible. So let's listen to it again now. From Matthew chapter 14 and verses 13 to 21. As soon as Jesus heard the news of the death of John the Baptist, he and the disciples went off in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowd saw where he was headed and followed by land from many villages. So when Jesus came out of the wilderness, a vast crowd was waiting for him, and he had pity on them and healed their sick. That evening the disciples came to him and said, "It's already past time for supper and there's nothing to eat here in the desert. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy some food." But Jesus replied, "That isn't necessary. You feed them." "What?" they exclaimed. "We only have 5 small loaves of bread and 2 fish." "Bring them here," he said. Then he told the people to sit down on the grass. And he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up into the sky, and asked God's blessing on the meal. Then he broke the loaves apart and gave them to the disciples to place before the people. And everyone ate until they were full, and the scraps were picked up afterwards. There were 12 basketfuls left over. About 5,000 men were in the crowd that day, besides all the women and children. So then, we've heard that familiar story of the feeding of the 5,000. We heard it as recorded by Matthew, but perhaps surprisingly, it's the only one of the miracle stories that's recorded in all 4 Gospels. So they must have thought it had an important message. So I thought we'd have a think about what is it saying to us today. And I think it's useful to look at the way each of the gospel writers report the story, because they all give a slightly different information about it and a bit more detail in some than others. If we read in John, we know it was springtime because he tells us that preparations were in hand for the Passover festival. Because of that, many more people than usual were around. And But surprisingly, Jesus was on his own. It's not often that Jesus is on his own unless he decides that he needs to get away to pray. But here he is on his own, because he's waiting for the disciples to return from a mission he'd sent them out on. And he must have been feeling a bit sad as well, because the news of the death of his cousin John the Baptist had just reached him as well. And then we pick up the story and we see the disciples coming back, and we can picture Jesus looking at them and thinking to himself, they look a bit tired. I think we could all do with a bit of rest. We can review the mission. And so he says to them, let's get in the boat, let's sail across the lake to a more peaceful spot and have a bit of time together. But all those crowds that I said were around, who had heard all about the wonderful things that Jesus was doing and teaching, see Jesus and the disciples getting into the boat, and they think to themselves, look, there's not much wind around today. If we hurry, we can follow the boat as it sails across the lake and be there ready to meet them when they get off. And indeed, that's exactly what happened, because instead of coming ashore for some peace and quiet, they're once again met by this crowd clamoring for Jesus. And what does Jesus do? Does he say, look, I've come here for some peace and quiet. Haven't you got any homes to go to? No, we read in St. Mark's account that he had pity on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And as I read that, I wondered whether in these days and the months that have passed, I wonder whether that's how many of us are feeling, that we're feeling a bit like sheep without a shepherd. We've come through springtime, we're now into summer, we've gone through those months not being able to meet together, at least physically, not being able to go to church as normal. Yes, we've been doing our best through phone calls and video get-togethers. We've started trying to meet up in the church gardens. But I wonder whether we feel a bit lost, a bit like that lost sheep that we heard about in our readings a few weeks ago. But remember, the Good Shepherd remembered the lost sheep. He wasn't able to rest while there were 99 out of the 100. He went there looking for the lost. And remember that story about those couple on the road to Emmaus. They felt lost, they felt hopeless. They were on their way home after Jesus had been crucified. All their hopes had rested on him. And he joins them on their journey. And he comforts them, he talks to them. And when they recognize him, they're given renewed energy to face the future. And Jesus' promise to us is that he'll always be with us. He won't let us get lost. He'll come alongside us on our road. That's his promise. And one of my favourite poems that talks about that is that one called Footprints in the Sand. So I want us just to think about that and listen to that poem now before we think a bit more about this story. So let's hear Footprints in the Sand. Footprints in the sand. One night I dreamed I was walking along the beach with the Lord. Scenes from my life flashed across the sky. In each I noticed footprints in the sand. Sometimes there were 2 sets of footprints, other times there was only one. During the lowest times of my life, I could see only 1 set of footprints, so I said, "Lord, you promised me that you would walk with me always. Why, when I've needed you most, would you leave me?" The Lord replied, "My precious child, I love you and would never leave you. The times when you have seen only 1 set of footprints, it was then that I carried you." So what other messages can we get from this story? Well, as I read it, one of the other things that jumped out from it was that many of us have been affected over the past 3 months from not being able to go ahead with things that we've planned to do. And I guess that even in normal times, if we plan to do something, to get away for a few days, and then something happens to thwart it, we can become a bit annoyed and frustrated, and perhaps even look to take our anger out on others. And I wondered whether, if this story had been left to the disciples, whether things would have turned out somewhat different. As we know, they were tired, they were looking forward to this time of rest, and here they were met by all those clamouring crowds. I wonder whether it had been up to them, they would have just told the crowds to go away, but not Jesus. Jesus, as I've said, had pity on them because he recognized them needing him, that they were like these sheep without a shepherd. And what a wonderful day it must have been, because it got quite late. Jesus had been teaching all day, and the disciples realized that no one had anything to eat properly, and it would soon be too late to get anything. So they come up to Jesus and say to him, "Well, I think it's about time you sent the people home. They need to have something to eat." And this is when he comes up with this statement that really surprised them. He says to them, "You feed them." What an absurd request that must have seemed. Here they were in more or less desert. And even if there were places to go to buy food, it would have cost a fortune for all those thousands of people. So what was Jesus saying? John tells us that he directs the request first of all to Philip, but looking around him, he couldn't see any way of doing that. His brother Andrew as well looks around and thinks to himself, "However are we going to do this?" But had they forgotten one thing? Andrew seems to be on the brink of thinking and finding a solution, as he finds a boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he brings them to Jesus. But then he says, "But what is this among so many?" But had they forgotten Jesus and the miracles he'd already done? Because Jesus seems quite satisfied with that gift. And he takes the 5 loaves and 2 fish and blesses them. And he breaks up the bread and the fish. And he hands it to the disciples, and he tells them to get the crowd sat in orderly rows and start distributing the food. And we read on that, far from it being too little, after they'd all eaten, the remains still filled 12 baskets full. So it seems a miracle had occurred. And I suppose the natural question is, how did he do it? How did that transformation happen? How did all those people get fed with just 5 loaves and 2 fish? Or was it the case, as some suggest, that when people saw that boy bringing forward his 5 loaves and 2 fish, that they were inspired to share what they had, the things that they'd bought for the day? Perhaps they had it hidden in their clothes or their bags. So was the real transformation not of the loaves and fish that the boy bought, but of the attitude of those 5,000? Was that the real miracle? Because if so, is that kind of transformation still needed today? And can it happen? Are we willing to share what we have? Not only food, but other resources and all the gifts that we've been given, rather than keeping things to ourselves. Are we willing to share what we have with others? In connection with this, I was quite struck with a story I read by an American minister, I think it's American or she may be Australian, Beth Quick, who tells us how she took part in what was called a hunger meal. And when the time came to eat the meal, everyone there was divided up by continent in numbers proportional to the actual populations of the different areas of the world. And she says that the majority of the people went to the Asian continent and a fewer number went to North America. And then when they were served the food, they were served the food in quantities proportionate to the amount of food that those continents took from the world's supply of food. And so those in North America got 2 meals plus a dessert. There was more than enough for all the people there. They even had a waiter to serve it. And those, though, in the Asian section had much less. And they were trying to divide what they had, how that little they had among them. And then she said, finally, near the end, as the people looked around and began to see the inequality of it all, they began to share what they had. And she says that's a vivid lesson she learned, clearly illustrating how much we have compared to how little many others have. But when the people shared what there was, all had enough. There was enough to go round for everyone. So as I say, are we willing to share what we have? Not just our food, but the other resources and gifts that we've been given. Well, perhaps we are. Because on a positive note, during the pandemic, when there were problems with the food bank being able to get the normal amounts of food that is donated in the supermarkets and shops and being able to brought to them, they put out an appeal for people to leave some food outside of their houses that people would then come along to collect. And many people put out what they could, and people came and collected, and over 2 tons of food was collected as a result of that appeal. More is needed again now. And at the end of this presentation, I'll put up a slide to show how what they want and how that can be donated, either through further gifts now that the supermarkets are available again to take supplies, but also you can actually donate money, and that can be gift aided, and the food bank can get what they want from those gifts as well. So there are ways of doing that, which are, as I say, are put up at the end. Last week, when Gary was speaking, he spoke about faith. And in another part of the Bible, James says this, and I'll read it from James 2:14 to 18. I'll just read it from my other screen. James writes, "My friends, what good is it for one of you to say that you have faith if your actions do not prove it? Can that faith save you? Suppose there are brothers and sisters who need clothes and don't have enough to eat. What good is there in you saying to them, 'God bless you, keep warm and eat well,' if you don't give them the necessities of life? So it is with faith. If it is alone and includes no actions, then it is dead. But someone will say, one person has faith, another has actions. My answer is, show me how anyone can have faith without actions. I will show you my faith by my actions." So then we are called to put our faith, our beliefs, what Jesus calls us to do, into action. As we look at the impact of the pandemic, and more generally when we look at other problems that the world is facing today, such as ongoing inequalities, prejudice, global warming, poverty. How often do we look around us and think like Philip and Andrew? We don't know, how can these be resolved? What are we among so many? Do we think to ourselves, what good will it I can do? What difference can I make? What difference will it make in what I do, in what I say? However, this story tells us that however small or inadequate the things we have to offer may seem to us, if we offer these with faith that God, who can make all things possible, can transform these, that together all of our small things that we can offer can be transformed. The disciples must have wondered whatever was going to happen when Jesus told them to get the crowd sat down in rows when he only had those 5 loaves and 2 fish. But they had enough faith to do what he said. They'd have looked foolish if nothing had happened. But perhaps that's a risk of faith. Are we then offering what we have in the faith that God will use it? Or do we give way to those feelings of helplessness and do nothing? Do we, like Paul, say, I can do all things in him who strengthens me? Or do we say, I can't do anything about problems and challenges so big like the ones we face as we see in the television or perhaps in our daily lives? If we believe that we never can eliminate poverty or prejudice in our communities and in our countries and across the world, and therefore do nothing, perhaps that belief will be fulfilled. But if we believe that those things which on the face of it seem insoluble, that seem impossible to be transformed by us just offering what we have to God, inadequate though it may seem, but in the faith that miracles can happen, let's do it. Think about how in the past things which seemed so embedded that they could never be changed did change through the work of individuals bringing together others but leading the way. People like Elizabeth Fry, William Wilberforce, Lord Shaftesbury, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. They managed to change things through their work that people thought were impossible. We still need people like that, because it's said that if they were still around, they would still have work to do about today's conditions in prison or modern slavery or 0-hour contracts, institutional or unconscious racism that we see around us. So when we are confronted with things that we see, the things we see around us today that challenge us, do we feel, well, we're not wise enough, or we haven't got the training, we're not professionals, there aren't enough of us to make a real difference, there's not enough of us to get the job done? Or sometimes when we feel like that, when we feel like Philip or Andrew felt as they looked out on the crowd and thought that Jesus was asking too much of them, let us remember that Jesus took what they had, nothing more, nothing less. Let us look at what we can offer, small though it may be, but in the faith that God can use it to perform mighty miracles. What are we amongst the many? Let us offer what we do have in the faith that God can transform it, that in him all things are possible. We now close with a blessing. So let us conclude these reflections with a blessing for the coming week. Let us go into this new week knowing that we are perfectly loved. Let us go with our ears pitched to the sound of God's voice calling our name, with our eyes peeled for the face of Jesus in unexpected places, with our souls poised to receive the Spirit of God, the Spirit of peace, empowered as a disciple of Jesus to share God's love with everyone we meet. Amen. If you can, please support the Droitwich Spa Food Bank. The website address is on the screen. You can support it by donating food and other gifts. There are a number of points to donate food throughout the town. Again, details are available on the website, or you can actually donate money. Again, details on the website. This can be done through the Virgin Money Giving site and other means, and it's possible to gift aid. So the food bank therefore gets additional funding via that source. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks.